Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Ivy English. I'm Bruce.
I'm Angela.
And I'm Wesley.
Well, our third day of this month, we have for you something about cell phones. I think maybe you know what they are, but do you know the history of cell phones? Our title of the lesson, a reading lesson, is Ringing in a New Era, the First Cellphone Call.
Do you know what I want to say quick is that cell phone as a word is actually going out of fashion because a phone is just what we used to call the cell phone, and the mobile phone is now a phone, and things that we used to call a phone are now your landline.
Landline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not even the home phone anymore. Like phones are just the square thing you carry around in your pocket, and everything else has got a special designation now. So what's the main thing called the phone has now adjusted to the cell phone era. The mobile phone era, the smartphone era.
So what do we call a cell phone now?
Phone.
Okay.
You talk to any child and they'll be like, phone. And then if you talk to them about cell phones or smartphones, they kind of look like you like, well, they squint at you. They're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. 好，所以这个 cell phone 这个字呢，现在已经慢慢没有人用，因为现在大家都叫它就是 phone， 因为对很多年轻世代来讲，他可能出生看到电话就是这个样子，就是手机，所以 phone 现在就是用来指这个 cell phone。 那如果说你要指家里面的那个家用电话，那个英文叫做 landline L-A-N-D-L-I-N-E landline 一个字。那我们这个文章呢，中文标题是首次手机通话，划下通讯史重要的一划，那个划就电话的划。那这英文标题呢 ringing in， 那个 ring in 它就是迎接的意思 to accompany the arrival of something， 通常是有 bells 有那个叮叮当当的，但现在基本上就是迎接。那英文里面常常讲到一个 ring in the new year。
Exactly.
Yeah， 就是迎接新年，就是 celebrate the beginning of the new year， 通常是在12月31号的 midnight， 常常是个 party。 那另外呢，这个 era 也有人念 era， 这个是时代的意思，它就是特别有一个特性，或者是有一些重要事件，或者是一个重要的人物，它让这一个时代有一个 distinctive character， 这个叫做 era。 像例如我们讲美国的历史上面有一个很明显的这个 colonial era， 或者是这个 the Reagan era， 就是雷根时代，那个时候的美国有很多的特别的地方，所以 era 这个字是这样用的。那 cell phone 大家都认识。
Okay, I'll read through the whole article first. Ringing in a new era, the first cell phone call. On April 3rd, 1973, Martin Cooper's voice echoed through the streets of New York City. This marked the birth of a new era in communication with the first ever cell phone call. Cooper held a device the size of a brick. He called his rival Bell Labs' Joel Engel to declare that his Motorola team had built a functional, portable phone. Before the first call, Motorola and Bell Labs were racing to build a cell phone. The intense rivalry fueled mobile communication advancements. After the first cell phone call, it still took another decade for personal cell phones to reach consumers' hands. Production challenges and government regulations delayed the device's arrival to the public market. The first cell phones to hit the market allowed for conversations of 30 minutes, but required a 10-hour recharge period. They cost $3,900, measured about a foot long, and weighed around 2 to 3 pounds. The bulkiness and expense of these early phones kept them from widespread use. However, as technology progressed, mobile phones became lighter and more affordable. These days, cell phones have become an essential part of many people's lives. Cooper, who is now 95 years old, knew back in the 1970s that cell phones would affect just about everyone. He said in an interview that he and his team used to joke that someday phone numbers would be assigned at birth and missed calls would come with deadly consequences. Their predictions hinted at how important their invention would become. The first cell phone call ushered in a new age of communication, one that would connect us in ways we never imagined.
So, on April 3rd, 1973, Martin Cooper's voice echoed through the streets of New York City. If you echo through something, it means your voice reverberates through the air and everybody hears you, like a old-timey public speaker in the square.
好，所以呢，在1973年4月3日，这一位 Martin Cooper 他的声音呢 echoed 就是回响。好 ，through the streets of， 那这是英文里面常常看到的一个语块哈 ，through the streets of somewhere， 就是在某个地方的大街小巷。那他这里讲的是纽约的大街小巷。那当然这句话是有一点夸张了，不太可能有一个人他的声音回响在整个纽约的大街小巷，这个应该是比喻的用法。
This marked the birth of a new era in communication with the first ever cell phone call. This reverberating voice through the streets of New York marked the birth. To mark, as we use it here, means to show that something has happened. In this case, what happened was the birth of a new era in communication, a new way to communicate between and among people. How? With the first ever cell phone call, which I'm sure you know and do many times a day.
Marked 这里就是标示的意思，所以这一件事情呢，标示着 the birth of a new era， 就是一个新时代的诞生，这几个字是常常在一起用的。Marked the birth of something， 就是标示了什么东西的诞生。那这个新的这个时代是怎么样呢？哪一方面的时代呢？我们加 in a new era in communication， 在通讯方面的一个新时代。那 with 就是它是跟 mark 来的哈 ，mark the birth of a new era with something， 就用什么来标示这个新时代呢？用的是 the first ever 有史以来的第一个 cell phone call 手机的电话。
So Cooper held a device the size of a brick. A device is what we say to mean any electronic sort of tiny machine. We call it a device. And in this case, it wasn't that tiny. It was the size of a brick. And presumably, he's standing on the streets of New York. And this next sentence says, he called his rival, Bell Labs' Joel Engel, to declare that his Motorola team had built a functional, portable phone. So obviously, he went to the street to call him to prove that he wasn't calling from a phone inside an office. This is what I think is going on here. This is implied, even though we haven't been told. But I mean, if you built the first functional, portable phone, obviously, you're going to go to the noisiest, streetiest, unlikely to have a phone place to call your rival and be like, na 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 boo boo, we did it first, ha ha, which is what he did, right? So what is a functional phone? A functional phone is a phone that functions. It works.
In many ways.
I mean, in any way, it works. That's the important thing. And then the second most important thing is that it's portable. You literally can carry it with you everywhere. Now, I mean, if you've grown up knowing smartphones, and everybody in high school has grown up with smartphones and phones in their house, like portable phones are like normal to you guys. But for us older people, a phone that you can carry around in your pocket is still kind of like a mini miracle. Because I grew up in a place where phones were simply things that people had in their house, and you had to wait to get home to call somebody, or you had to get to your office to call somebody. And using a phone was like a pretty special thing. It wasn't just like any kid could use a phone. We had to get an adult's permission to use a phone. And if you had to call, like even across the United States, that would be a long-distance call. Even when I was in high school, I had to find out some information from my college, and my mom was like, just call them, it'll be faster than writing. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to make a long-distance call to New York City. Crazy, you know? And now, like, I think nothing of calling my mom on the other side of the world.
所以这个地方讲到说 Cooper 他 held 手上拿着一个 device 一个装置，通常是个电子装置，然后呢这个电子装置 the size of a brick 就是它的大小就是一个砖头的大小，那这个 the size of 前面你可以说省略的 which is a device which is the size of a brick， 就这个是一个砖头大小的一个装置，他手上拿着，然后呢 he called 他打电话给他的竞争者 rival， 同位语告诉你他的竞争者是这个贝尔实验室里面的 Joel Engel， 然后呢目的是干嘛呢？是 to declare 来宣布一下，宣布说他的 Motorola 的 team， 他在这个摩托罗拉他的团队呢 had 已经做好了，因为这是在打电话之前就已经做好了，所以是用过去完成式。 had built 一个 functional 就是有功能的，可以运作的，它的同义字是 operative OPERATIVE。 那它不但是 functional， 而且它是 portable， 它是可以携带式的一个电话。那刚刚 Angela 老师讲说，其实在我长大的时候呢，我们这个手机没有这种东西，我们的都是家用电话或者办公室电话，所以你要打电话必须要在那个办公室或者家里面，当然街上也有一些公用电话，没有办法像手机这么方便。
Now you may wonder why Martin Cooper called his rival Joel Engel. Before the first call, Motorola and Bell Labs were racing to build a cell phone. This tells us that two very large and important American communications companies, Motorola and Bell Labs, were in a competition. They were racing to build a cell phone. They knew that if they could ever make it work, it would sell like hotcakes.
Sell like hotcakes 就是热销，像这个刚刚烤出来那个热蛋糕一样，大家抢着买。所以呢，他接下来告诉你说，在 before the first call， 在他打了第一通电话之前，在他打这个第一通电话之前呢，摩托罗拉跟这个 Bell Labs 这个贝尔实验室呢 ，they were racing to， 他们在彼此比赛要干嘛？这个 race 在这里就是 to compete in a contest of speed， 就是速度上的比赛，他们在比谁快，能够干嘛呢 ？We're racing to build a cell phone， 他们比赛看谁能先做出一个手机，这个行动式电话。
I think it was even more important for Bell Labs, though, because they were the ones to invent the first telephone.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing is that when the first telephone was built, Bell called his assistant in the next room, and they used that to prove that it worked. So this is kind of an echo, but instead of calling somebody inside their lab, they called their rival to lord it over them. But it's the same thing, like when you finish building it, then you call someone to tell them about it.
Yeah， 好，所以他蛮有趣的。他做出来之后就打电话给他的竞争对手，而且用这支行动电话来打，这个真的是让对手很挂不住面子，而且主要是他可以宣扬他的成就。
And so the intense rivalry between these two companies, the one who's trying to defend their title and the one who's trying to nab the next title, which is Motorola, it created an intense rivalry. You can have a rivalry where two people are like, ha ha ha, I'm better than you, nana. But intense implies a whole nother level of concentration and sort of emotion in here. And this intense rivalry fueled mobile communication advancements. So these two people, these two groups working so hard to be faster than the other one, fueled or added fuel to or created speed in mobile communications advancements.
好，所以 intense 是激烈的， rivalry 是竞争，就是 the state of being rivals。所以这个激烈的竞争 intense rivalry， 各位可以把它背起来作为一个 collocation。那 fueled 在这里它是当动词用，它名词是燃料，动词就是供给燃料，也就是助长的意思。To provide with fuel， 那引申成为 to support 或者 stimulate the activity， 或者是 the existence of something。所以这个激烈的竞争，这两个人之间激烈，这两家公司激烈的竞争呢，就是助长了或者是促进了行动通讯的进步。好 ，advancements 是进步的意思。
Okay, second paragraph. After the first cell phone call, it still took another decade for personal cell phones to reach consumers' hands. So Martin Cooper in 1973, he had the first, I guess we would call it a prototype, the first of its kind, but that was not ready for people to use.
It wasn't even in production yet. Building something by hand and building something in a factory at scale is very different.
Mm-hmm. So this first cell phone call belonged in history compared to today. It wasn't until the 1980s that the public could buy and use cell phones.
And by the public, we mean the very richest top layer. And by, the thing is, information moved much more slowly then. It's really hard to explain to young people now how slow it went. I did not even know that cell phones existed until 1998, which is 25 years after this first cell phone call. Like, I was surprised that this call was so early, because the first time I ever even heard of that there's such a thing as a mobile phone was 1998.
所以呢，这虽然手机第一通电话1973年就产生了，但是其实之后的发展不算非常的快。例如说，这里讲到说，在这个第一个电话之后呢 ，it took another decade for something to happen， 就是 这件事情要发生还要另外10年 another decade 就另外10年，让什么事情发生呢？ For somebody to do something， 所以他这里说这个不是 somebody， 他是 for personal cell phone， 就是个人的行动电话，你要让个人的行动电话能够 to reach 能够到达 consumers hands 到达消费者的手中，还需要10年的时间。所以像刚刚 Angela 老师也讲，他这个第一通电话之后大概20年之后他才知道说有手机这东西存在，所以这个进步是没有我们想象中那么快。
Now, production challenges, because you have to find a factory that knows how to manufacture this like brand new tech, which means you have to train people, you have to build machines, you have to build a production line. It's not a simple thing. So these challenges, and then also government regulations. So there's regulations about who can use the airwaves, because before cell phones, airwaves were divided into radio use, to military use, and to like private, like, what do you call those, walkie-talkie kind of channels. And then there's like shortwave, and there's a lot of regulations about which waves can be used by whom. And so that also delayed the device's arrival to the public market because they had to decide how to classify the cell phone wave in the air. Who's under whose control? Who regulates it?
OK， 好，所以呢，我们看到这个叫做 production challenges， 就是在生产上面的一些挑战因为做出第一个机器跟你要量产中间还是有很多事情要做，所以生产上的挑战还有政府的法规regulations 法规。那 delayed 就是延迟了 the device's arrival 这个装置的到达。那 device 在这里指的就是 personal cell phones， 它延迟了个人手机的到达哪里呢？ arrival to the public market， 到达大众市场，换句话说它要上市，这个其实还又经过了10年才有办法。
The first cell phones to hit the market allowed for conversations of 30 minutes, but required a 10-hour recharge period. Well, if you hit the market, that means you start to be available on the market, and you could talk, but only for 30 minutes. After that, you had to recharge it for 10 hours.
So can you imagine people basically kept their phones off all the time until they needed to make a call?
好，所以呢，这个第一个电话做出来第一批电话呢 the first， 然后一个名词后面常常用一个 to， 一个不定词片语来修饰这个名词，所以这里我们看到 the first cell phones to hit the market 就是上市的第一批行动电话， hit the market 就是上市，各位把整个片语记起来。那 allowed for 就是可以让你干嘛呢？可以让你conversations of 30 minutes 可以让你讲30分钟的电话，但是呢 required 它需要一个10个小时的 recharge period 所以什么 period 那就是一个什么样的时间，所以 a 10-hour recharge period 就是它需要10个小时的充电的期间，所以你可以讲半个小时，但是充電要10个小时。
So at the time, they cost $3,900, which honestly, in Taipei right now, would be 12,000.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But the thing is, that's still not the right price because everything in inflation has more or less doubled in cost. So in today's US dollars, it would be basically $8,000. And so they measured about a foot long. They were huge. They weighed about 2 to 3 pounds. They weighed as much as a laptop now, and they were the size of a brick. They were very ugly.
所以他们要花费多少呢？当时要花费美金3900元，这换成现在的话，大概现在可能要美金要7-8千块了。它 measured 是一个连缀动词，就是它的大小是多少，后面通常就是加它的大小，所以这里讲到说它量出来呢大概是1尺长，所以大概有30公分，而且呢它 weighed 它的重量是多少呢？ weighed 在这里也是连缀动词，就后面直接加补语，它的这个重量是多少呢？重量是大概2到3磅的重量。
The bulkiness and expense of these early phones kept them from widespread use. Okay, bulkiness is the brick. It may not be that large, but it's heavy, it's awkward to carry, and expense. That was a lot of money back then, $3,900.
好 bulkiness 就是大又笨重，所以它又大又笨重，还有它的 expense 就是它的 cost 它的花费，像我们讲 expensive 就是它的形容词，所以它又笨重又大然后又贵。 of these early phones 这些早期的电话又大又贵又笨重，那 kept them from 让他们无法怎么样得到 widespread use 广泛的使用，所以他们一直没有办法广泛被大家利用。
Especially when you consider that a landline phone would be $25 to install plus the handset. So far different. However, as technology progressed, mobile phones became lighter and more affordable. If something is affordable, you can buy it. Like right now, cell phones cost about 5万块, and people feel like it's affordable because they need them.
好，所以 affordable 就是能够买得起的意思。那所以呢，虽然是这样子，用的人不多，早期的电话，但是随着科技的进步，那所以随着科技的进步，大家可以学起来，英文就是这样讲 你可以这样讲 as technology progressed。好，所以呢，随着科技的进步，行动电话变得比较 lighter， 变得比较轻，而且呢 more affordable 更让大家买得起。
These days, cell phones have become an essential part of many people's lives. Essential means necessary.No matter where you go, you can see and hear people using their cell phones.
好，所以现在呢，各位可以把这个句子背起来。These days, 手机已经变成了很多人生活里面的不可或缺的一部分 have become an essential part of many people's lives.
Cooper, who is now 95 years old, knew back in the 1970s that cell phones would affect just about everyone. He predicted this.Yeah,
just about 就是 almost, nearly 的意思。所以 Cooper 现在已经95岁了，他知道 back in the 1970s, 他早在1970年代就知道手机 would, 在这里是 will 的过去式，他当时就知道手机将来会，所以这个地方是 will 的过去式 would， 他当时就知道手机将会影响几乎每一个人。
He said in an interview that he and his team used to joke.They used to have fun with each other, telling each other funny jokes or stories, that someday, in the future, phone numbers would be assigned at birth. So you wouldn't just have a name when you were born, but you would have a permanent number that people could call you at.
I mean, people do that with emails now. They get an email when their baby is born.
Really?
Yeah, that's been a thing for at least 10 years.
Okay. Missed calls. A missed call, it means someone called you, but you were not available at that time to pick up the phone.
Yeah.
It would come with deadly consequences, so
People
I'm glad
would
they
die.
Yeah. That's why the sentence says they joked about it, that, if you didn't use a cell phone for 5 hours a day, you would have to go to jail.
好，所以他说呢 in an interview 在一次访谈中，他说他跟他的 team 他的团队呢 used to joke 就以前常常开玩笑 used to 是以前常做的事情，开什么玩笑呢？说 someday 有一天这个 phone numbers 电话号码 would be assigned at birth 就出生，所以以后有一天出生的时候，他就会分派 assign 一个电话号码给你。那刚刚 Angel 老师讲，现在这个有婴儿出生，这有些地方已经你一出生就给你一个 email 的账号了。然后呢，另外接下来有一天呢 missed calls 就是没有接到的电话，没有被接到的电话 missed calls 将会怎么样 come with 就是 accompany 都会带来 bring with 或者 go along with， 所以没有接到的电话会带来什么东西呢？会造成什么呢？会造成 deadly consequences. Deadly 是致命的 consequences 是后果。
Their predictions, so the things that they thought would happen, hinted at or gave an indication of how important their invention would become. They were aware through their jokes, or they used their jokes to sort of talk about how aware they were that this was a very important thing.
So hint at 就 to direct indirectly suggest 的意思，所以他们的这个 predictions 就是间接的告诉我们说什么呢？ How important their invention would become， 他们所发明的东西将会变得多么的重要。
Okay, our last sentence of the lesson today. The first cell phone call ushered in a new age of communication, one that would connect us in ways we never imagined. To usher in is to introduce. The cell phone was a completely different kind of communication,And it certainly has connected most people and businesses in ways we never imagined.
好，所以第一通的手机的电话呢 ushered in 就是带入了，正式开启了一个 new age of communication， 一个新的通讯时代。然后同位语说这样的一个通讯时代是 one， 就是 one 这个指的就是 a new age of communication， 它会 would connect us 会连接我们 in ways we never imagined 用一些怎么样我们从来没有想象过的方式连接我们，所以 in ways we never imagined 就是 in ways that we never imagined。
So there's a couple questions here for you. Number one is, what was the purpose behind Martin Cooper's historic call?
好，那 Martin Cooper 这个历史性的电话，它背后的目的是什么呢？
The answer is to gloat. G-L-O-A-T, gloat.
也就是去炫一下啦。所以呢，就是要告诉他的对手说，我做出这个电话。
And so to tell his rival that his Motorola team had built a functional portable phone.
Number 2, what slowed down the process of bringing the first cell phone to the public?
好，所以这个手机为什么没有办法很快的到达这个大众的手上呢？
There are 2 points to consider here. One is production challenges. To make these things, it was a whole new world to make small phones that could do so much. And another point is the government regulations. We talked about this earlier. The waves, you can't use TV waves or radio waves. You have to have a special system. And that is something that the government controls, so you also have to work with the government.
好，所以主要有2个，一个是生产方面的一些挑战，东西不好做；另外一个就是政府有一些规定，那使得这个手机没有办法很快上市。
Okay, that's it for today's lesson. Join us again in a couple of days. We're going to have fun with ferrets.
Yay.
Until then,
Bye-bye.